So welcome to Arable Scotland, guys. Great to have so many of us in this session. I think there's 83 in total, so that's a great number, seeing as how we would normally get roughly 150 at the event. We had hoped it would have been a field event, but when we were doing the planning for this, it was unfortunate that back in February we had so many business policies from the organisers that just didn't allow us to proceed with the in-field event. So the crops weren't planted. There was only a few trials put in. So there was really, when people say, "Oh, why aren't you having the event?" It's like, well, we stopped the process of planting the crops and the trials to actually showcase when we were there, and we paused the marquee for another year. So hopefully next year we'll be back to Balrudry and we can have a proper event. So on to today's session on markets. What whirlwind of a season for markets. I'm sure all the traders and farmers will agree. It's how would you know what to do? Hopefully some people managed to get the top price in the 190s, even some in the 200s for the wheat. It's been fantastic. So we're joined today. We've got James Webster from AHDB, who will give us an update on the stocks in the UK and a bit on the global market. We then should have Julian Bell from SRUC. So he will give us a bit more in depth. There's obviously a lot going on in the domestic markets with the merger with Lindsay's MSP and, of course, the Ingle scenario, which is to play out pre-harvest and just what that opens up for us. It probably puts the malting barley instead of a Scottish market into more of a global market. So that seems to be quite good. We've then got Wendy Russell, who is involved with Robert and the hemp growing project, which is a new market, new opportunity. Wendy's background is a bit more in nutrition. So we obviously have this systems approach. You are what you eat. So our livestock are what they eat and our plants are what we feed them. So there is this whole scenario going on that actually we need to start and address this to try and sort out our markets and that. And Wendy will come on to the benefits of hemp and the fibre, obviously, is a new market, which is there. And we're joined by Robert Ramsay as well, who's going to give us an update on the hemp project. Robert, most people will know, farms at Kinblethment and is also director at SoilEssentials as well. So Robert will give us on that. So we've got 20 of you guys that are lucky enough to be in the panel. I can see Andrew Booth's there as well, obviously in the hemp project. So it'll be great to hear from Andrew and obviously a bit on his gluten-free oats, which will be a cracking update when we get to that stage. So we're going to kick off with James first. Session is being recorded, so we can just ask everybody that is live if you can just mute yourself while James is running through us. We're quite happy to take interruptions and questions as we go. So if you've got a question, for those that can, feel free to pop your camera on and just put your hand up. For those that are in the Q&A, I'll try and chair that as we go. So we'll hand over to James to get us started.
Good morning. Just share my screen now. So hopefully you can all see that. So as Chris alluded to, it's been a pretty wild year for markets so far this year. We always knew that it was going to be certainly from the beginning of the season, knew that it was going to be a tight one from a global supply and demand perspective. And then that was really amplified throughout the early part of the year and into sort of the January, February time. A mix of factors coming into play there from a La Nina event, which meant hot and dry weather for South American crops, delayed planting, and we're still seeing the ramifications of that as Brazilian maize crop forecasts get ever smaller and tighten the global market more. We've seen Russian export controls. We've seen strong buying from the Chinese, which has, again, been another huge factor. Of course, there's always a degree of uncertainty around Chinese figures, but they've been looking to both rebuild their pig herd following African swine fever and also rebuild stocks of crops as well following the pandemic. And that's something which has really amplified some of the price rises. Alongside that, I mentioned coronavirus briefly just now. It's been a huge factor for global economies. And as a result of that, we've seen a lot of fund investment and a lot of managed money is the term that's used in Chicago markets, where you've got the likes of pension funds and general fund managers. We've seen a lot of them move into commodities. We've seen record levels of investment. We've seen some huge long positions held on an anticipation that markets are going to go higher. And that's all added as a multiplier into the price rally we've seen up until sort of early May. Following that, we obviously have seen prices tail off from the highs they were at. And again, there's a number of factors building into there. So more of what would be the bullish news is being priced in. The Brazilian crops, there's now a range of estimates right down to 85 million tons from what was 110 million tons of maize production in Brazil for the second crop this year. And that's something that has really been a concern. Crop conditions in the US have been another thing to watch, and they've been improving steadily, certainly for maize. The crop's looking good. They've got a good acreage figure. Have been some declines in those figures, but they're still looking pretty healthy. And all of that is sort of culminating in the removal of some of this risk premium that have been built into markets. We're expecting better crops for next year. I'll come on to that again on the next slide, but we've also seen funds starting to trim those long positions. More interest in other aspects of economies, and we've seen certainly for maize and for soybeans as well, which is obviously a key driver of the rapeseed market. We've seen funds back out of some of their long positions, and that has pulled some of the support from the market. I mentioned that we're set for a better supply situation certainly in the grain market. That's true for global grains, although it is very marginal, and that's something which we need to watch very closely. So although there's a general feeling of bearishness to prices at the moment, the margin for error in the global grain market is very small. So the International Grains Council, in their most recent forecasts, which were published last week, highlighted that the surplus of grain production over grain consumption globally is just 2 million tons. It wouldn't take much for us to lose that 2 million tons of production if we were to see poor weather in the US, or even just shift to US acreage figures for grains. So there could still be opportunities on the horizon. So there's some key watch points that we need to pay attention to. Although we're looking like we're heading for better crops in the Northern Hemisphere, we do need to pay attention to the size of the US maize and soybean crops, what the funds are doing. That Chinese demand is still going to remain all important. But also we need to pay attention to what happens beyond the Northern Hemisphere harvests. Once they start to get priced in, we'll see some of the risk probably come out again, and we could see more pressure. But it's then the next level of plantings. There are some very big numbers forecast for Brazilian maize, Brazilian soybeans for next year, and also some pretty favourable conditions for Australia. So these are just the things that we need to be aware of on a global scale, that although the market is at the moment feeling quite bearish, there could be some support factors out there that we need to watch. But on the whole, bearish feel to global markets. From a UK perspective, we're coming out of a very tight window. We're going to present two crop forecasts for wheat and total barley here. The first one of these is the USDA numbers from the GAIN report. The second numbers are my forecasts for supply and demand for the coming season. Unsurprisingly, given what we saw, like I said, last year, really poor establishment, we're going to see better crops, certainly for wheat. The barley crop will be smaller owing to a smaller spring barley acreage. We're also expecting to see improved oat area, although given where prices have been and where prices were during the spring oat planting window, may well see a bit of a shift in some of that acreage, and as a result, a slightly reduced oat production from where this is now. Oilseed rape is an interesting one. Obviously, for much of the UK, there have been challenges with flea beetle and obviously the loss of neonicotinoids, and that's seen the oilseed rape figure plummet in terms of the acreage planted. I would suspect that we may well see a return to more acreage when it comes to planting, in September, obviously in England. That's primarily driven by the high prices we've seen. Vegetable oil markets have been on fire. Prices have been up sort of around the €500 per tonne mark for oilseed rape on the Paris futures. And I would imagine that will draw increased acres into oilseed rape in spite of some of the agronomic challenges that are obviously presented by flea beetle. As I mentioned, a couple of different forecasts. So the first ones in that last slide were from the USDA. This is a bit more of my view of supply and demand as we go into next season. As I mentioned, larger crop number for wheat. I think most of the trade are sort of converging around a 15 million tonne wheat crop, maybe a little bit more. But the big thing to pay attention to here is the low stocks that we're coming into this year with. As a result of the tightness we've seen this year and reasonable levels of consumption, we are going to see a very low opening stock figure, which is going to leave us in a position where we do need to import a fair amount of wheat next year. We're also going to see a return to more normal demand levels, or I would suspect we're going to see a return to more normal demand levels for wheat. It's driven by a couple of factors. From an animal feed perspective, I would expect that we'll see what we are already seeing, a redressing of the discount of barley to wheat. It stretched out to around £40 per tonne ex farm around January, and that really prompted increased barley usage. It's now back in at sort of normal levels, £15, £20 per tonne discount, maybe a little bit less than that in some areas. And that should prompt increased wheat demand in animal feed. We're also at a point where certainly coming into the start of this season, we're going to see more biofuel demand in the UK. And then again in January, we should have the second biofuel plant, the Vivergo plant, which has been offline for some time, open up. And that will prompt more demand back in for wheat for the production of biofuel. On the whole, the UK market still looks as though it's going to be relatively tight despite better supplies, and that's primarily due to that opening stocks figure that I mentioned. So UK prices are going to have to remain near the top of the global sphere to attract imports. From a barley standpoint, again, we're coming into this year with low stocks because we've seen such huge animal feed demand this year because of the discount I mentioned. Demand on the whole has been greater, but obviously we've seen a lot lower demand from the malting and distilling sectors. The primary driver of that was winter barley demand in England. Having looked at the maltsters purchases in 2020, it looks like certainly for Scotland, and I guess that's the shape of the industry with more of a distilling market, the demand was less impacted in terms of the reduction in barley purchases, although obviously was still hit. I would anticipate as we go into next year, hopefully a continued return to pubs reopening, although a recent report from the CGA did suggest that somewhere between 20 and 30% of venues are still to open across the UK. I believe that figure was something like 25% for Scotland. And those that have opened are obviously opened at reduced capacity. Hopefully, I'm sure you're all really hopeful that we see those pubs continue to reopen and we can get back to a degree of normality. And I would expect to see malting barley purchases return to near normal levels. In terms of animal feed, I'd anticipate maybe slightly ahead of average as we go into next year, maybe to address some of the demand that we've coming out of this year with, if we've got diets that need to continue to be run with barley. But on the whole, a more normal year with a more normal discount for feed barley to feed wheat. So that's it from me. I will now hand over to Julian.
Thanks very much for that, James. Just before we go on to that, was any questions roughly on the stock levels? I mean, I suppose one for me, James, was obviously last year there was quite an oversupply, 2 million tonnes oversupply of barley, but it seems that we're quite short of barley. So, how is this playing out? It's quite an interesting one. And obviously I'm envisaging for more of the livestock industry, we've got beef and lamb that's trading at a bit of a premium now. Are we going to see more pressure on the barley market?
So I think we've already seen quite a large volume of barley come through in feed, and that's why our stock figure is going to come out so much lower in the end of this season. like I mentioned, that £40 per tonne discount that we saw in January resulted in loads of diets shifting heavily into barley. And now, as we're speaking to plan how that market is trading, old crop barley is very difficult to get hold of from a merchant's perspective. So I'd expect a degree of normality and potentially in terms of kind of the barley trade next year. But certainly coming out this year, it's feeling very tight. Prices have adjusted accordingly, so we're back at a more normal level of discount, certainly for feed barley. Malting barley's obviously been a challenge all year, and premiums have been hit because of the lack of demand. Like I say, fingers crossed we move back to some more normal levels of premium and some more normal levels of supply and demand in that sector as well.
Oh, fantastic. Good. Well, we'll move on now to Julian, and hopefully we'll attend to a bit more of the domestic side of things. Especially, I know the malting barley situation will be on the tip of most people's tongues, and whether we're going to open up. Malting barley is obviously a global trade as well, so there is an export potential there. What's your thoughts, Julian? We'll let you take us through this.
That's great. No, thanks. Thanks, Chris and James. So in a second, I'll just share some slides. So, I think the premium, which James touched upon there, is obviously that quite a lot of that's going to be a local affair to some extent with the way the crops turn out here. But clearly, there's a lot of drivers around the world that could influence the whole base price of all the grains. But just now, I was going to look a bit closer at local supply and demand for wheat and malting barley, and a little bit of a structural issue I think we face in Scotland. We've also had some unfortunate developments recently with one of the grain merchants going out of business. So that's got obviously a lot of ramifications for individual farmers, but clearly for the wider industry, that's one less buyer, and that follows close on the heels of the fact we had another buyer closing and being merged with another one. So that brings us back to the question of, what market power has the farmer got? What is the cropping mix? Is that something to look at in terms of alternative markets or alternative crops? So I'll just sort of set a few scenes on that. So I'll just hopefully share my screen in a second. Hope that's coming up okay. Is that shared okay?
That's perfect there, Julian. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So that was just spelling out. Look at wheat use in terms of distilling, obviously our big local market. Malting barley, clearly we've got a lot of local things as well to look at. And then this sort of reduction in the buyers, does that really spur us into looking harder at some alternatives as well? So with distilling wheat, so the top chart is showing the monthly usage. So it had, and then you've got sort of 3-year averages in the previous year. So you can see we're very clearly ahead of what we've been normally used in distilling. In distilling, wheat use is obviously clearly by far the dominant use of wheat in Scotland, something like 60-70% of the wheat potentially in that order anyway. So you can see a massive increase there, and it's been relatively sustained. The gap seems to narrow a little bit in the last few months, but generally we're doing quite well in terms of use. And that's had a dramatic effect on our prices because we actually run unusually below England. We've had good wheat crops the last few years, and we used to have a premium in Scotland. We've lost that at certain times, and in fact, part of this year we were actually cheaper than England. But that's rebounded, and that is quite a large extent due to distillers turning to wheat. There's an extra 80,000 tonnes, or 13% extra wheat was used so far up to April, and that is obviously a big impact on a relatively small market. So, and that is to a large extent driven by the price differentials. There are some plants that can switch from maize to wheat, and they've obviously chosen to increase their wheat usage. And that you can see just at the bottom, it's just showing an indication of Scottish wheat relative to other imports. And distilling is really largely driven by French because of issues around possible GM contamination from other sources. So it's largely French maize. And yeah, we're a big discount in January. We're at, even if you look at the new crop, this might be slightly out of date, but certainly it's a pretty healthy discount to maize. And again, everything that James was saying about what's happened to the world maize price is going to determine what that differential is. But clearly, if world maize price stays up, our distillers are going to use as much local wheat as they can. And so far, that's obviously been beneficial. So, yeah, a local issue, really important. That goes back to the world market as well. So we're just at that point, as James said, while we take a look at how those big maize crops come in around the world. Let's move on to whiskey. So a little bit, as James was saying about the malting barley use being down through a lot of the pandemic, Scotch whiskey exports were down 23%. So $1 billion was lost in 2020. That's a huge impact. There was, of course, the COVID effects. We also had the US has had tariffs on Scotch malt whiskey, which have been really damaging, £600 million of lost sales. So that's all fed through, and I'm sure that was possibly a factor in our low premiums last harvest in Scotland. Now, moving forward, the good news is we've got a 5-year suspension on those US tariffs on Scotch malt whiskey. So that's a massive relief to the industry, and hopefully we'll regain quite a lot of that lost, or more of that lost market. COVID is slowly unwinding. It's pretty slow, but obviously we're perhaps a wee bit ahead in the UK, but other parts of the world are behind, so that could take some time to hopefully get back to normal. But at least we're on the starting path of that. There are one or two things as well, maybe a little bit more for the future. We've got Australia, UK free trade. Whiskey was a potential gainer out of that. So, and the investment in the whiskey industry continues. We hear of more proposals for maltings and things just recently. So quite a positive thing there. We've come out of a bad place, but hopefully we're heading back to a much better demand situation over the next year to 18 months, let's say. And it just shows a similar chart to what I showed with wheat. It's just showing how much the malting barley use per month was reduced. So the purple line is just showing really we were running well below what we had been pre-pandemic. But we're just crossing that point now with the April data where actually we're getting well ahead of obviously where we were, and it's starting to look more healthy. So up 30%, 1% increase in April, so that's good. Let's see if that continues, but certainly we seem to be moving away from that very low usage that we had. So that's the sort of going back to the next part of the equation, which is what we're going to produce. So now on the wheat side, pretty similar wheat area, but almost the same from last year is in the ground according to the AHDB survey. So you'd expect a relatively similar wheat crop given the weather. Well, we'll see how the yields turn out, of course. Spring barley, there's actually a reasonable uptick in the planted area there. So it's expected to be 265 versus 259 last year, so a sort of smallish increase. But again, that's obviously very different from England. And I think from our own point of view, there's going to be a lot less spring barley south of the border. Now, granted, a lot of the barley, extra barley last year wasn't necessarily for malting, but it's obviously a lower supply coming into the UK market, so that is potentially positive for us here. There have been other things at play. Obviously, we've dropped all the EU requirements, so we don't need the 3 crops rule particularly, and that has perhaps helped a little bit. And I'll come back to areas in a minute. And just to make the point that the premium here, so the premium in Scotland was just in the very small single digits last year for malting barley, £3-4 a tonne at best. Where in England there was about 13 pounds a tonne premium. So that was just showing we've also had plenty of barley here in Scotland. The question is, what is our local supply and demand going to be in Scotland, irrespective of the wider malting barley market? So we've got a slight increase in area. We have had this rebound in the yields of spring barley. They were more or less flat for quite a few years. Whether it's new varieties coming through, or whether it's perhaps the climate or weather conditions, but we're certainly getting a really strong improvement in yields in just the last 2 or 3 years. So that's a major factor in terms of what we can produce here. And this chart is just a table. It's very early days. It's just trying to show, what is the potential supply and demand situation for malting barley. The demand is, obviously, we're not very clear what that is at the moment. It looks like it's improving, but clearly it's been down on where it was. Production, well, in 2020, 1.77 million tonnes of barley, assuming a typical conversion to malting barley, you've got 1.276 thousand tonnes. Now, if usage was 780, then we were actually only needing 64% of it for malting, which is on the low side, and that tends to lead to lower local premiums. And looking to 2021, depending on which yield you take, sort of higher yield, lower yield, you could end up being a pretty similar or even potentially slightly worse situation. Of course, we don't know about demand. It may well rebound better than I've necessarily got here. So just take this with a bit of a pinch of salt. But if we do get a reasonable crop, it looks like the pressure could still be on the local premium. But yeah, it's early days for that. But it's just a risk, obviously, that we're aware of. And just moving towards the end of the presentation, as I said, we've lost 2 grain buyers this year in Scotland. One was because one expanded and took another one over. And the latter one was because a grain trader, Ingalls, went into liquidation. As I say, it's a major wrench for many people involved. So a difficult thing to deal with. But in the wider sense, there's certainly this net loss of 2 grain buyers. And I know there's farmers, there have been discussions away, look at ways of collaborating within the farming community and how to maybe strengthen supply. And that's definitely one area that everyone's looking at closely. But I think equally at an individual farm level, there's the alternative, which is, if you can diversify the number of buyers for your traditional crops, that's great. That's definitely supported. If that's going to be difficult, then of course it makes you think, well, maybe we should diversify the type of crops we're growing, or the type of markets we're targeting, and being very dependent on a smallish group of buyers is never a particularly comfortable situation to be in. And the other thing to bear in mind is the crop areas. So the 3-crop rule is gone. There are still some restrictions on exactly how much barley might be grown, but it's tending to push the malting barley area up. And if you look sort of 2014 to 2021, 274 in 2014 before the 3-crop rule, 265,000 in 2021. So it has crept up. We've also got some additional ground. We've got land going into hybrid rye for mostly for AD, and we've got 1 or 2 other crops going into AD as well. So smallish amount, but you can see that is sort of helping just take the edge off of the area of spring barley. I think if we look at any alternative crops that could be growing out there, if you can take 15,000 hectares into something else, which I think we'll be discussing later, you can see the market impact can actually be really large, because you could be taking 70, 100,000 tonnes of malting barley off the market. And the key thing is it gives the buyers more competition for the cropping. If there aren't enough buyers to compete amongst themselves, then the farmers can create competition by growing more crops and more alternatives. As we know, we'll come on to that, I think, a bit later in terms of discussions. What are the options? But it's certainly a structural issue, and now's a good time to look at it. So really just to wrap up, the global market's feeding through to everything, particularly the distilling. If the maize price, wherever the maize price goes, it stays high, it'll help our own wheat use. Malting, feed basis there. What is our local crop going to do? We've got to look pretty hard at that in terms of what is the yield going to be, what's the quality. And just finally, we've got a structural issue which suggests, can we diversify the number of buyers? Can we diversify the number of markets? But I better leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Julian. Lots going on this season, isn't there? prices volatility, and then obviously the Ingalls scenario yet to play out with whoever buys that on, and of course the contract with Diageo is really going to be the key question there. Just a few updates, guys. For those on the right hand side of the screen, you'll see the two tabs just below the very top and hop in. You've got an event tab and you've got a session tab. If you click the session tab, it'll drop you into this session, and then you've got the chat, polls, people, Q&A. So if you in the Q&A, if that's where you want to pop your questions, and then if you scroll right down, I've popped a link in there for your basis and Enroso points. So that's just a little bit, hop in does take a bit of getting used to. It's one of the better platforms around, as we've seen. So a couple of questions there, Julian and the group, which we'll come on to. Are we in danger of overcooking the oat market with the 6% increase? Is the price going to plummet? Are we going to see quality rise? What's going to happen there, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, oats are. I think that there's more pressure obviously coming further south, isn't it, as an alternative to oilseed rape? So James maybe want to comment on that, but it's again those niche crops. It's all about contracts, as everyone knows. You've got to have a contract, and there's more choice in terms of quality of the end crop. That puts pressure on the growers to deliver. We're clearly facing the extra production down south is sort of feeding up here as well. Again, it's a niche. It's a great niche, but it's a small one. So, yeah.
I mean, so from my perspective, certainly from an oat market standpoint, you've got almost two very distinct markets between your contracted oats and the remaining market for the oats. So contracted oats based on a feed wheat price, you'll obviously get a better return for those. So if you can get a contract, you're almost guaranteeing yourself a better margin. And certainly that's what we've seen this year, where you've got contracted oats at a discount to feed wheat, earning some really good values. And then you've got the other oats in the market, particularly feed oats, which we're looking at like £115 per tonne. In some instances, earning a real discount there. There is a risk, particularly with the oat market. There's not a huge amount of anticipated increase in demand, apart from obviously the main oat milk or oat drink manufacturer, I suppose I should say, in Oatly opening up down in Peterborough. But even then, to produce the large volumes of oat drink they're talking about producing, it's 45,000 tonnes of oats to begin with, maybe rising to 60,000 tonnes. We've got 1 million tonnes of production, and we've got a milling demand for oats of 500,000, 550,000 tonnes. It is a risk of an oversupplied market, in my opinion.
Very interesting. To hear that as well, we are quite protective of our oats in Scotland, certainly, good Scottish crop there. Perfect. So we'll move on next to our next speaker, which I think we're going Robert. Is that right? Yep. So we'll hand over to Robert Ramsay next to take us through some exciting new crops that's been grown.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Talk by Julian and James, and from my farmer's perspective, every time I listen to one of these talks, I just feel like a wee boat on a rough sea. And there's just so much going on, and it's how do we navigate our way through that? Because there's such big drivers that we're not really in control of. And I suppose my farmer-to-farmer advice is that there's only certain things you can control. You can try and work and control our costs and our yields, and that's pretty difficult. A challenge to you is how much time do you spend actually trying to do something about your price. I think we spend a lot of time looking at our costs and our yields, and then we just tend to take the price we can get and not really have much of a strategy. And I think it's deserving of as much time as you can possibly give it. I don't think it's in our nature to do that. And second is the importance of storage. Certainly for me, I'm selling my malting barley right now. Last load left yesterday. I'm selling it massively above what I would have got it for malting as feed. And it just is having the storage. I think if you don't have the storage, you're not in the game. And unfortunately, we're seeing that if you're relying on other people for the storage and to help you, you've got to be very careful about that as well, because there's some big risks. So we're moving to the opportunities, really. And what I think has been really interesting, a few years ago, a lot of you might know, and some might not, that the plastics industry really came to the ag industry looking for solutions to help them get to net zero. And that started that sugar beet thing. And all industries are going to have to get to net zero. And they're going to be looking for alternatives. And it's my view that we are massively an alternative, because basically every product you see is either recycled, or it's mined, or it's grown. There aren't really many other ways of doing things, and mining things is not really particularly sustainable. So every product that you see is going to try and fight to find a way to become greener and more carbon efficient. And we are one of those potential solutions. And if we just ignore that, that opportunity will pass us by. And that kind of became the driving force behind the hemp situation, where there was a risk group, where a lot of us were talking about hemp, and it's almost overwhelming how many opportunities hemp has. And Wendy will talk through some of these in a minute. And, you know, right back in that WIS program, it was Wendy's introduction to these opportunities. And we didn't really do anything because it was so overwhelming. And eventually 10 of us growers just said, no, right, let's just do it. Let's stop waiting for government support. Let's stop waiting for co-ops to be formed by other people. Let's just go and put some skin in the game. There's 10 of us growing some hemp, and that has accelerated the process by which there's interest in developing in this. Where are we with this? The 10 growers growing hemp that's in our little group. We decided to grow a variety that would use our existing machinery the best. So we're growing a variety in what we know, the market we know, which is food. So we're growing a Finnish variety, so similar sort of latitude, and it's combinable. Now, the thing with hemp is it's not needing a lot of ag chem, and it's got specific ways of growing, but you put it in quite late. You don't put it into a cold soil. And so we all waited to put it in May. And certainly in Angus, there was no chance of getting any machines in any fields in May. So I think Andrew's online here. Up in Aberdeenshire, they managed to get some of theirs in May, and the crops are looking fantastic there. Ours are quite a long way behind. But what's interesting is, okay, the crops are going to come through. We're going to try and make some money selling those crops, but it's what it's developing and the markets that are developing for us round and about. So we've had people coming to us now saying, can you supply us straw in 2 years' time, in 3 years' time, in 4 years' time? And the same with some of the food things are just starting to open up on the CPD. So yeah, my message really keys on look for opportunities, because you're going to need them. We're all going to need them. And Wendy is one of the ones that supplied us these opportunities. So I'm wanting to pass on to Wendy as quickly as I can.
Thanks very much, Robert. So we'll move on now to Wendy, hopefully.
Okay. Hi there. I'm just going to try and share my screen if I can. So let's just check. Can everyone see that?
Yep, that's us.
Okay, I'll just pop it open then. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about opportunities, and I do come from a nutrition background, so bear with me, there'll be a bit of nutrition in this talk today. So you walk into a supermarket and you might be fooled into thinking that our diet is really diverse. There are lots of products on the shelf, but in actual fact, 75% of our food comes from just 12 plants and 5 animals. So we really have what is a very poor biodiversity. So globally, this isn't good. But from a human perspective, from a diet perspective, it also isn't good. It really limits our diet diversity. And this is something that's really important to us. And of course, many of these products, they're not produced sustainable. They travel long air miles. So they really aren't doing the climate any benefits either. And I just want to point out a few things to you first. First of all, if we look at what people are dying from in Scotland, you can see on this graph on the left-hand side, most people are dying from non-communicable diseases. By far, that is the biggest cause of death. And non-communicable diseases includes things like cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes and some cancers. And really, a lot of those are diet-related. So our diet in Scotland is really poor. And if we think about meat consumption, which is another important thing, if we think about global consumption worldwide, our population doubled from 1950 to 2000. And yet meat intake increased fivefold. So the predictions are for 2050, when we're going to have in excess of 9.1 billion people on the planet, we would need 465 billion kilograms of meat to feed that population. Now that just isn't feasible. We don't have the land or the water or the food to sustain that level of meat consumption. So things really do have to change. And I just want to show you in this lower panel at the bottom just how much things have changed in different countries. So in the center panel, you can see the statistics for the US. So the US is very similar in trend to the UK, and what we've seen from 1960 to the current day is around 30% increase in meat intake. In India, where meat intake due to religious reasons is a lot lower, we're also seeing in excess of 30% increase in meat intake. But in China, if you look at the statistics there, from 1960 to the current day, we've seen 1,442% increase in meat intake, and it doesn't look like that's going to be curbed anytime soon. So we have a real challenge ahead of us if we're going to try and move people from meat consumption to a more plant-based diet. Fortunately, there is a real desire to have a plant-based diet, and I'm just going to show you some statistics here. This is a plot that I made of scientific articles where they mention plant-based as a diet. And if you look, it's been exponential. You know, to the current date, there's been a huge increase in research in this area, looking at innovative plant-based solutions, looking at plant-based crops, looking at their impact on health. It really is a growing scientific research area, but it's also an important area to the general public. If you type plant-based into Google, you get 2.25 billion hits. And if you look on Amazon, there are over 60,000 plant-based books available. And if you seriously look at the market value, in 2019, it was estimated to be around 11.1 billion. Now that's expected to increase around 15% per annum. And in 2027, we expect that market to be around 35.8 billion. So it's a big market and there's an appetite for it. What can we do in Scotland? So over the last decade, we've been looking specifically at high protein crops that could be grown sustainably in Scotland. Well, of course, we grow lots of peas and beans, and peas and beans are great. They have about 20% protein. They're quite high in fibre. They're a really interesting and useful crop in the human diet. But we've been looking at some other crops just to see, look at some alternatives, particularly high protein alternatives. Lupin is really high in protein. It's almost 40% protein, and it's very high in fibre. But when we talked to a lot of the food manufacturers and consumers, there was real concerns around the allergenicity of lupin. It's one of the named allergens, and people want clean labels, so we didn't really think it was a viable crop to take forward in our studies. But we've really focused on two crops, buckwheat and hemp. Now, buckwheat's been really interesting. We found some compounds in buckwheat that reduced blood sugar. So we done an intervention in people with type 2 diabetes, both controlling it with diet and those controlling it with metformin. And the extract from buckwheat that we fed them reduced blood glucose. So buckwheat has potential as a food ingredient for a particular market, for people who are choosing a healthy lifestyle or people who are trying to live with conditions such as type 2 diabetes. But what I really want to talk about today, and we're really excited about, is hemp. And I'm glad Robert's already mentioned hemp to you. Now, the reason we're really excited about hemp is there's many reasons to grow hemp. The first, and probably really important reason, is that hemp is excellent at carbon sequestration. I mean, I think it's been estimated that around 1 hectare of hemp will absorb about 15 tons of CO2. It's probably the fastest CO2 to biomass conversion tool that we could have in the UK. So if you look at the graph up on the top left-hand corner, you can see that it really outperforms timber. And with the estimates that we were looking at, around, if you were to plant around 0.25 million hectares of hemp in Scotland, and our current emissions are around 41.6 million tonnes, we could possibly reduce that by up to 20%. So it's really important from a carbon sequestration. It's also important because it can be grown with reduced inputs. I mean, it's got vigorous growth and great shading capacity, and it can be grown without herbicides, pesticides, and fungicides. And nutrient inputs from nutrient inputs, it does need some nutrient inputs, but the increases in yield are really marginal. So it has a really nice profile when we look at inputs. Also, it's great for land remediation. At the top of this graph, you can see there's a small piece of hemp material. In under 10 minutes, 1 gram of hemp material could remove 7.6 milligrams of heavy metals. That's actually quite a lot of heavy metals. So if you wanted to remediate some land, maybe some urban land, and you know, prior to using it for crop production, hemp would be an ideal first crop to put in there to clean up the land. And you could, of course, use the straw if that was possible. I mean, legislation doesn't really help with a lot of these issues. Hemp is also great for crop rotation. It has this fantastic deep taproot that really frees up the soil, and it brings a lot of minerals to the surface. In some of the trials that have been conducted, there's been up to 20% increases in crops planted after a year's cultivation of hemp. Also, hemp is showing that it's really beneficial for increased biodiversity. And there's been a couple of really nice reports where they've looked across a whole range of markers on biodiversity. And hemp has really been one of the forerunners in increasing biodiversity in the farm, much higher than traditional Scottish crops like barley and oats and traditional fruits and vegetables. So it's great for biodiversity. And from our perspective, we've done a lot of work looking at the health impact. I mean, hemp is rich in nutrients, high in protein, high in fiber, high in micronutrient minerals, has a great range of bioactive molecules present there, a fantastic ratio of omega fatty acids. We know it's good for nutrition. But on top of that, we've also run human studies, and we've showed that, you know, it reduced hunger and it improved sugar metabolism and modulates important gastrointestinal hormones. So hemp's fantastic from a health perspective. But as Robert mentioned, it also has much wider use. And I'm really taken by this statement by William Shakespeare, invention in a noted weed. That sort of refers to the fact that the paper he wrote on was produced from hemp. I mean, the Declaration of Independence was written on hemp. The first pair of Levi's 501 jeans were made of hemp. Hemp is a fantastic material for textiles, bioplastics, biofuel, construction materials, composites, paper products, graphene substitutes. But it's also really versatile as a food ingredient. You can use hemp to produce an oil, you can use it to produce a milk, and you can use it to produce a flour. We've been working closely with the UK's biggest supplier, Good Hemp. And the reason we're working with them is when you press hemp to make an oil or a milk, there is a lot of co-product. And what we've been doing is looking at trying to revalorize those co-products into higher value food products, adding even more value to hemp and a stronger circular economy. And just in the lower right here, we've been working with a lot of designers and artists, and this is some fabrics from a Danish designer called Tanja Kirst. And they're fantastically beautiful fabrics that they're producing. They look very much like Harris tweed. So, you know, there's markets out there. People want sustainable products, and I think hemp is something that, you know, would be an ideal use. So hemp is just one of the products that we are interested in. I'm just trying to stop sharing now if I can. Does that mean stop sharing? Yeah. But there's lots of other things that we're excited about and lots of other crops that I can tell you about at a later date.
Wow. Wendy, thanks very much. A serious amount to take in there, guys, isn't there? I mean, who knew hemp was so versatile? So potentially one of the upcoming new crops to the market. So we had a couple of questions in the chat there, just for the group. Is hemp, Julian, James, is hemp tracked at all? Hemp production, hemp sales? Is there anything like that at all in the market?
Well, in terms of the areas produced or area grown, or this production or usage?
Production, sales, usage. Is it a global commodity? What do we know?
It's in a pretty small niche at the moment, I think, globally. I know it's obviously much bigger in other countries. You'd have to have a look. I haven't seen anything personally, but
I'd echo that. I mean, it's always the case with smaller markets, particularly at the point where they're at the point of their inception, that information is quite lacking. So in terms of pricing structures, it's very dependent on a small number of buyers. So you kind of gain information from them to begin with before it grows as a product. So in terms of tracking that market, it is limited.
Wow. Yeah. Impressive. Robert?
Yes, so I mean, when we decided to grow it, we could estimate what yields we might get. but the prices we just couldn't. And you know, it is a very, very niche market. In terms of it's actually multiple markets. So the food side of the market is very small, and we know that there's a distinct undersupply in the UK. So there's a lot of hemp coming from France or previously from China. But it's a question of getting scale. The CPD part of it, they're not medicine, they're additives like that, is one that's got really oversupplied. So there are these very tiny niche markets, and even more so than the oat. If they get oversupplied, the price could crash. When they're undersupplied, the prices are very, very good, but not published.
Interesting. And in terms of growing, Robert, is the harvest date a risk? Presumably it's going to be quite late this year. What's your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, the harvest date and the harvesting are huge risks. So it is going to be after wheat, and it needs a certain number of sunshine hours or days. And seeing as we couldn't plant it in May, that really is going to affect it quite badly. So that's going to be tricky. The key component of this, though, is we're starting an industry, and JHI and others are desperately keen to be involved in developing varieties that suit us better. So this is a variety that's grown in Finland. I would imagine that they struggle with late harvest as much as we do. But once we get the breeding into it, I think we can change some of these key dates and manipulate it that way.
And in terms of the footprint of growing it, I mean, presumably it doesn't need a particular amount of nutrition to grow it, and in particular, obviously, our NPs and Ks will be fairly well reduced from that. How are you finding it through the season?
So I read that, and I very quickly come up with an answer that's based entirely on my guesswork. When we're producing the seed, we're taking a very small quantity off the field. It's high value, small quantity. But when you start growing the varieties that are going to be making hempcrete and insulation and things, they are phenomenally tall. And that must surely be taking an awful lot of P and K off when you take all of that straw away. That would be my guess, but I haven't got figures.
Yeah. Andrew, have you comments? How's Aberdeenshire season going?
I think there's two tails of the Aberdeenshire season. There's the ones that went early and went against didn't wait for the soil temperature, and they've got a phenomenal crop. And then there's us who waited and not such a phenomenal crop at this stage. We've fed it a little bit with digestate, trying to take I think the idea was to take about 100 kilos of N, similar to barley. Agree with what Robert's saying in terms of off-take, because we're just taking the seed just now, not overly concerned. But I think there is opportunities, there's no doubt about that. And harvesting late in Aberdeenshire is not uncommon, so we could handle that.
Well, you're geared up for it, yeah. And how's the gluten-free oats going? Yeah,
no, there's, talk about niche market, milling, Julian was saying milling oats are niche. Well, we're a niche within a niche. But with a free from market growing at 17%, per year, we're hoping to see that niche market grow, and if the market does change in terms of, or the STLAC in terms of the parts per million, if it gets reduced, and we're sitting with a plant that is dedicated to gluten-free production, we see us being in quite a good position. We're hoping that that will grow, and over the coming years, we're going to be looking for growers as well.
Absolutely, fantastic. Nice little plug there for Oatco Scotland. Looking there, Rebecca Russell, is Finland taking a lead in production? Which are the key countries involved? Presumably you guys did a feasibility study, so you've looked at a bit of this? Maybe?
You're a funny guy, Chris. I think maybe Wendy knows better than I do where the key production is. But it is very much based on legislation in that area, freeing it up. And we are still absolutely hand-tied by that. Wendy, do you have a good idea?
No, not really, but I do know that the Nordic countries...
Sorry, you're on mute, Wendy. If you click.
No.
I can unmute you. There you go.
Sorry, yeah, I do know that the Nordic countries are stepping up production. They're very active in production. I know from the partner that we're working with, they used to source almost exclusively from China, but they now can source enough from France. So I think within Europe, France must be quite a major producer if they're supplying enough to meet their needs. But I think hemp is on a lot of countries' radars. You know, we're seeing more and more cooperatives springing up all the time. But we haven't done that feasibility study, so I can't give you an accurate answer there, I'm afraid.
Yep. Okay, thank you. And I suppose while you're there, Wendy, just a question here about the fertility side of it. And we were sort of roughly discussing this with the nutritional value, and there was the buckwheat discussion that we had coming into it as to how you build nutrition. And buckwheat's an interesting species as well, which you had on your list. And, you know, it's part of the famous 5 in most cover crop mixes that should be looked at. Can you tell us a little bit about the nutritional side of it and just, you know, perhaps a bit about buckwheat and potential there?
Yeah, so buckwheat was slightly lower in protein, but it was a crop that we were really interested in because we were seeing a lot of evidence of it being beneficial from a health perspective. So we included it in our high protein crops because we knew that it was being grown in mixes and things in Scotland and had potential to be produced there. It was really exciting for us when we found there were these compounds that were present in buckwheat that reduced blood glucose, because one of the biggest problems we have in Scotland with regards to health is metabolic disorders such as type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So having crops that can actually reduce postprandial glucose is really important. And something as versatile as buckwheat, which you can put into a lot of different foods, could really help that market, you know, achieve their glucose reduction. So that was our interest from a health perspective in buckwheat. It's not something that's not, you know, the hemp's picking up. Buckwheat from a food perspective in Scotland, it's not even started, but it's something that could be on our horizon.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, again, the seed price of buckwheat is fairly prohibitive until it gets grown a little bit more. But again, people that are into it, 5% buckwheat in a cover crop mix, it's absolutely there. We know it's a short growing season, harvest is fairly quickly, so there is an opportunity there. Even Mr. Booth, you know, you could companion crop buckwheat and oats there for your gluten-free. Well, I don't know if it would quite give you gluten-free oats, but it would be a benefit, would it?
I'm not sure if we would want to contaminate. I mean, to companion it with that, but there's definite opportunities, and I think that, you know, we're talking about rotation and nutrition, you know, with our that's something that we're focused on, and, you know, putting different crops into that. And we're fortunate enough that we can grow rye with our AD plant and we've got grass and that, and that's something that we're seeing making massive differences in our farming setup. So it is about feeding that soil and getting that nutrition in right, and not taking out all the time, but always trying to get stuff back in. So yeah, we're looking at we're growing clovers now to try and, you know, to get that back, you know, to get put something back in as well. So
you're almost hinting at cover crops being grown in Aberdeenshire there. That's a dangerous discussion between you and I.
Well, I think that is a very dangerous discussion between you and I, Chris. But I wouldn't say it's cover crops that can actually grow. And I think that's the challenge that we're having in Aberdeen, to find the right cover crop that will actually generate. We've got green manures that were planted again, a bit like the hemp this year, that because of the dry spring haven't grown, and we're sitting there with black ground. So what is the benefit within a scheme if you're just got black ground, because because we're told we can't let it seed and we can't destroy it until the 15th of August, and we delayed planting, and by delayed planting we now don't have a crop. So to me, I don't disagree with the cover crop or a green manure. I think the restriction is within the time these dates that are put in place.
I absolutely agree, and I'm sure Andrew Moyer, you know, had that in his Arable Climate Review group as well. And it's, you know, sometimes legislation can prohibit the best coming out of some of these ideas with it. Last question there. Obviously, hemp's fairly well regulated. Would you guys be able to touch on that a little bit? It's not just quite as straightforward in terms of applying for licenses and what parts you can actually grow, is it?
it's a bit of a nightmare. As a grower, it's not that bad. If you just want to grow a little bit, you apply in January to the Home Office, you tell them what your use is, and they give you a permission unless your field can be seen from a road, and they don't give you a permission, or unless you don't have any previous convictions or anything like that. But from growing an industry, which is what we're trying to do this at scale, how can we create a co-op and invest in expensive machinery to process this if our growers can't even apply for the license till January of the year they're growing it? We need multi-years of knowing that we can deliver this product and building the market and building the processing plant. And it's an absolute bleep nonsense. And it needs to be sorted out because there's nothing dangerous in this crop that I'm growing here. You could burn the whole field down and you wouldn't get high. It's ridiculous.
I absolutely agree. I mean, is that the future potential, is looking at these smaller co-ops, these hubs, where you can get more grower buy-in and perhaps, a little bit more out there, something to look at for Scottish Government, perhaps?
I absolutely think, I said right earlier on that these opportunities exist. This is a classic example of an opportunity that does not exist for a single farmer. This is an opportunity, and there are many others that exist for an industry. And unless we, as an industry, take these things forward, you know what? Somebody else will find a way of fulfilling that niche, whether it's with seaweed or whether it's with some clever carbon capture system. We need to have green building materials, green clothes. We've got to stop making things out of oil. And if we gather together and work together, we can produce solutions that will make us all richer and make our ground in better nick and all of these good things. But if we just let that go by, it won't work. So we've got to work together, and we've got to produce these smaller crops. We've got to be risk averse and actually trying this out and failing occasionally and actually delivering something that's sustainable and long term.
Absolutely agree, Robert. Cooperation is definitely the way forward. Well, look, thanks very much. That seems like a cracking statement to end on. So thank you very much to everyone that's joined us this morning, and to the speakers, and Wendy for enlightening us so much. You will be hearing from Wendy in the future, that I can guarantee you. We'll be delving into those far more greater detail. So thank you to everyone that's there. You'll see the sessions. Great thing with Hop In is you can just leave it on, and as the sessions start, you're automatically put into them. So if you want, just leave your computer on, go for lunch, and the sessions will just continue on. We're in the booths, I think, from 1:30, which is the Expo tab down the left-hand side. So please join us in there if you can do. And again, at the bottom of the Q&A tab is the link to the basis and enroso points. So thanks very much for everyone today, and we're not too far over time, so we'll leave it there. Okay, thank you.